She was sitting quietly in the front row, scribbling in a worn notebook, wearing jeans and a faded sweatshirt. No badge, no uniform, no title visible anywhere on her body. And to Officer Derek Mason, that made her nobody. That made her a problem he could solve with a pair of handcuffs and a smug smile. He had no idea he was about to make the single most catastrophic mistake of his entire career. He had no idea that the quiet woman with the scratched-up sneakers and the thick-rimmed glasses had spent 2 decades dismantling corruption rings that made his little operation look like a lemonade stand. He had no idea that she had taken down federal officials, cartel-connected politicians, and decorated law enforcement officers who thought their badges made them untouchable. He had no idea that within the next 45 minutes, his badge, his gun, his pension, and his freedom would all be gone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with an arrest, it starts with a choice. And every single domino that fell afterward traces directly back to the moment one arrogant cop decided that a woman in a college sweatshirt didn't deserve basic human respect. The Riverside County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning looks exactly like every other government building that's slowly losing its battle against time and budget cuts. The lobby smells like recycled air, burned coffee, and the low hum of anxiety that follows people through courtroom doors. Fluorescent lights flicker in the hallways. The marble floors are scuffed from decades of foot traffic. The wooden benches in the gallery are worn smooth from thousands of people who have sat and waited and hoped, and sometimes walked away with their hearts in pieces. It was in this building on an otherwise forgettable Wednesday that Detective Chief Inspector, that is, Chief Designate Mara, Elaine Sutton, was sitting in the second row of Courtroom 7, watching, just watching. To anyone who glanced her way, she was invisible. Mid-40s, lean build, natural hair pulled back simply. She wore dark-washed denim, a heather grey university sweatshirt, and a pair of low-profile running shoes. No jewelry beyond a simple analog watch on her wrist, a Timex, the kind you buy at a pharmacy. She had a battered composition notebook balanced on her knee, and she was writing in it with a focus that suggested either deep concentration or complete boredom, depending on who was looking. Nobody was looking. That was entirely the point. Mara Sutton had just accepted the position of Chief of Police for the Riverside Metro Department, a department that had been hemorrhaging public trust for years, 3 internal affairs investigations in 18 months, a federal civil rights lawsuit still pending, a culture so corroded by unchecked ego and institutional loyalty that good officers who tried to do the right thing found themselves quietly transferred to desk jobs while the bad ones got overtime and commendations. The incoming mayor had recruited Mara personally. He'd flown to Washington, where she was finishing her final case as a senior field director with the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, a unit that existed for one reason: to hold law enforcement accountable when law enforcement refused to hold itself accountable. She had closed 41 cases in 16 years, 37 convictions. She didn't lose often, and when she did, she learned why, and came back harder the next time. The mayor had offered her the job over dinner at a restaurant neither of them could fully afford on a government salary. He'd slid a folder across the white tablecloth. She hadn't opened it. She already knew what was in it. She'd done her own research weeks before he called. She had one condition before she accepted. She wanted 3 days. 3 days to move through the city unannounced, unremarked upon, completely anonymous. No police escort, no briefings from department brass, no carefully curated ride-alongs designed to show her only what the department wanted her to see. She wanted the raw, unfiltered, unpolished version of what this city's police force actually looked like when nobody important was watching. The mayor had agreed without hesitation. Honestly, the speed with which he agreed told her everything she needed to know about how bad things actually were. A man confident in his department would have pushed back. He hadn't pushed back at all. This was day 2, and Courtroom 7 was already delivering exactly the kind of education she'd come looking for. Officer Derek Mason had been on the force for 9 years. In those 9 years, he had developed a very specific understanding of how the world worked, or rather how it should work. The world in Mason's operating framework was divided into 2 categories of people: those with authority and those who needed to be managed by people with authority. He fell firmly into the first category. Everyone else was a candidate for the second. He was the kind of officer who entered every room like he was auditioning for a role in an action movie. Wide stance, squared shoulders, chin slightly elevated. His uniform was always spotless. His boots were always polished, His haircut was always tight. He carried himself with the particular brand of confidence that is indistinguishable from arrogance until the moment things go wrong, at which point it becomes something much uglier. He was currently finishing his testimony in a suppression hearing, a legal proceeding where the defense was arguing that evidence obtained during a traffic stop should be thrown out because the stop itself had been unconstitutional. The defense attorney, a sharp young woman named Patricia Osei, had been asking Mason calm, methodical questions for 20 minutes. Mason had answered each one with barely disguised contempt, sighing heavily, answering in clipped monosyllables, rolling his eyes when he thought the judge wasn't looking. Mara had been watching him the entire time. Not just his words, his body language, his energy, the way he interacted with space. She noticed the way he scanned the gallery during pauses in questioning, looking for an audience. She noticed the watch, a serious timepiece, brushed, platinum case, exhibition dial, the kind of watch that belonged in a display case at a luxury boutique, not on the wrist of a patrol officer who cleared $68,000 a year before taxes. She noted the make and mentally flagged it for later. She also noticed the way he testified. She had spent 16 years listening to people under oath, and she had developed a near-clinical ability to identify the difference between a person recounting truth and a person constructing a narrative. Mason was constructing. The pauses came in the wrong places. The details were too precise in some areas and too vague in others. The story had the shape of something that had been rehearsed rather than remembered. When the judge called a 15-minute recess and the courtroom began to empty, Mara stayed where she was. She uncapped her pen and continued writing. She didn't notice Mason approaching until his shadow fell across her notebook. "Hey!" The word landed like a stone dropped onto a glass surface. Flat, intentional, designed to get a reaction. Mara looked up slowly. She met his eyes without expression. Mason gestured toward the small placard at the end of the row. Reserved for law enforcement and legal counsel. He pointed at it the way you might point at a sign for a toddler who'd wandered into a restricted area. "You see that sign?" "I do," Mara said. "Then you understand it doesn't apply to you." His eyes moved across her, jeans, sweatshirt, notebook. "Move to the back. Public gallery is behind the bar. You know what a bar is?" He wasn't asking because he wanted information. He was asking because he wanted her to feel small. The question was a tool, not a query. Mara set her pen down carefully along the spine of her notebook. "Court is in recess," she said. Her voice was unhurried. Matter of fact, the verbal equivalent of still water. During recess, designated seating restrictions are suspended unless the presiding judge has issued a specific order to the contrary. No such order exists. I'm within my rights to remain here. Something shifted in Mason's expression, not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. He'd expected one of two responses, either immediate compliance or flustered, stumbling pushback. He hadn't expected precise, accurate, calm, legal citation delivered without even a flicker of intimidation. He didn't like it. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, stepping closer, too close. The deliberate invasion of personal space that was one of the oldest intimidation tactics in the book, designed to force a physical recoil that could then be framed as aggression. "Move now." "And I've answered you twice," Mara replied, not moving a centimeter. "If you'd like to continue this conversation, you're welcome to. But I'm not moving, and you don't have grounds to make me." The vein at Mason's temple began to pulse. He grabbed her arm. Not firmly. Not with the controlled professional restraint that use of force training is supposed to produce. He grabbed her with the reflexive, physical anger of a man who was used to his authority being a self-fulfilling prophecy, used to the fact that the mere act of reaching was usually enough to produce compliance before contact was even made. Mara didn't comply, so the contact happened, and once it happened, Mason didn't ease off. He escalated. He yanked her to her feet. Her notebook hit the floor, her pen rolled under the bench. "You're being detained," Mason announced to the nearly empty courtroom. His voice had that specific performing quality, loud enough for an audience, controlled enough to sound official. "Failure to comply with a lawful order." Mara looked at him steadily. "You should think very carefully about what you're doing right now," she said. "I'm giving you one opportunity to walk away from this." "One opportunity," he laughed. A short, dismissive exhale. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are." "I know exactly who I am," Mara said. "The question is whether you're about to find out." He spun her around, pulled her arms back. The handcuffs came off his belt. Standard issue, double-locked, and he clicked them into place, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Except most of those hundreds of times, the person in the handcuffs had actually done something wrong. He marched her out of courtroom 7. She let him. The drive to the precinct was 11 minutes. Mara counted them. She also counted the number of times Mason took a corner too fast. 4. The number of times he accelerated from a stop with unnecessary force. 7. She noted that he had not read her rights. She noted that he had not offered her a seatbelt. She noted that when he glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression was not the neutral professionalism of an officer conducting a lawful arrest. It was the expression of a man enjoying himself. Every observation went into a mental file that was already getting thick. The booking desk at the 14th precinct was managed that evening by a desk sergeant named Kowalski, who had the particular energy of a man who had stopped asking questions 6 years ago and was simply waiting out his pension. He looked at Mara over the top of reading glasses that had slipped halfway down his nose. "What's the charge?" "Failure to obey, disorderly conduct, resisting." Mason rattled off. Then, as if he'd just remembered something, he added, "And obstruction." She was interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties. Kowalski typed. He didn't look up. "Name?" "She's not cooperating," Mason said. "I'll cooperate with my phone call," Mara said clearly. "That's constitutionally guaranteed. I'd like to exercise it now." Kowalski finally looked up at her. Something in her voice, the absence of fear in it, the precision of it, made him pause for a fraction of a second. Then he went back to typing. "Put her in holding. She can have her call." The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect from a precinct that had been underfunded, mismanaged, and demoralized for the better part of a decade. Concrete walls, a metal bench bolted to the floor. A steel toilet with no privacy partition. A fluorescent tube light humming overhead at a frequency designed, it seemed, to slowly erode the will to live. The smell was industrial cleaner, failing to cover something organic and unpleasant underneath. Mara sat down on the metal bench and looked at the walls. She didn't look like a woman who had just been unlawfully arrested and thrown into a holding cell. She looked like a woman sitting in a waiting room, completely composed, completely contained. Like someone who had decided, a long time ago, that she would never give a room the satisfaction of making her feel small. When the cordless phone was finally brought to her, 20 minutes later, which was itself a violation of procedure, she dialed from memory. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, she handed the phone back through the bars, sat back down on the metal bench, and waited. 32 minutes later, the front doors of the 14th precinct opened. They didn't just open. They opened the way doors open, when someone on the other side has stopped caring about the structural integrity of the hinges. Mayor Jonathan Reeves walked in first. He was a composed man by nature, a former city attorney who had built his political career on measured, careful, deliberate action. He was not composed right now. His face was the specific color of a man who has just received news so catastrophic that his body hasn't yet decided whether to respond with rage or nausea, and is currently attempting both simultaneously. Behind him came Deputy Commissioner Franklin Walsh, a 28-year veteran of the department who walked with the stiff, careful posture of a man who knew he might be about to watch his entire legacy implode on camera, and behind Walsh came a cluster of journalists, print, broadcast, digital, who had been set up outside City Hall for what they'd been told was a routine appointment announcement press conference. The mayor had told them, simply, to follow him if they wanted the real story. Not a single one of them had hesitated. The precinct went quiet, the way a classroom goes quiet when a principal walks in. That sudden, instinctive collective stillness. Mason was at his desk. He had his feet up, a coffee in his hand, and had been mid-sentence in what appeared to be a boastful retelling of the afternoon's events to 2 other officers who were nodding along with the bored politeness of people who had heard this kind of story too many times to be genuinely impressed by it anymore. His feet hit the floor when the mayor walked in. He stood up, straightened his collar, tried to rebuild his expression into something professional. He actually thought in that moment that this might be good news. An unexpected visit from the mayor. In his precinct? Maybe someone had filmed the courthouse. Maybe this was recognition. He took a step forward. "Mayor Reeves," Mason began, voice confident, chest out. "Welcome to the fore." "Don't," the mayor said without looking at him. He said it the way you say it, to a dog that's about to jump on a guest. Flat. Final. Mason stopped. He watched, the confusion spreading across his face like a slow flood, as the mayor, The deputy commissioner and 12 members of the press walked directly past him without a second glance and headed toward the holding cells. He followed. The hallway outside the holding cells was narrow, under the harsh overhead lights, with cameras and microphones crowded in from both sides. It felt like the set of something that was definitely going to be replayed on screens across the country before the night was over. Mayor Reeves stopped in front of the cell. He looked through the bars. Mara Sutton was sitting on the metal bench with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. When she saw the mayor, she didn't stand up immediately. She waited one beat, just one, then rose with the unhurried dignity of someone who had decided weeks ago that this city's chaos was going to end, and nothing that had happened in the last 2 hours had changed that decision by a single degree. The deputy commissioner unlocked the door. His hands were not steady. Mara walked out. She looked at the red marks still visible on her wrists from the cuffs, pressed a thumb against one briefly, and then looked up. Mason had pushed his way to the front of the press cluster. His face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching frightened, though he was still fighting it, still clinging to the script he'd written in his head on the drive back from the courthouse. The script where he was the one who'd maintained order. The script where the woman in the sweatshirt was a problem he'd solved. He opened his mouth. "Sir, I don't know what she told you, but this woman was trespassing in a restricted area, and she resisted." "Officer Mason." The mayor's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Every camera in the hallway was already rolling. Every microphone already live. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." He turned slightly, so that he was addressing both Mason and the cameras simultaneously. "The woman you handcuffed in a courthouse this afternoon, transported without reading her rights, booked on fabricated charges, and placed in a holding cell is Mara Elaine Sutton. She is a 16-year veteran of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. She has led 41 investigations into law enforcement misconduct across 9 states. She has prosecuted corrupt officers, corrupt officials, and corrupt systems at every level of government." The mayor paused. "And as of 9 o'clock this morning, she is your new chief of police." The sound that didn't come out of Mason's mouth in that moment was more telling than anything he could have said. His jaw moved. His eyes moved. The blood moved out of his face so completely and so quickly that the officers standing near him actually shifted slightly, as if preparing to catch him. The cameras captured all of it, every frame. Mara stepped forward. She stopped 2 feet in front of Mason, and she looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a problem, not with emotion, with clinical, precise analysis. "You had multiple opportunities today to choose differently," she said. Her voice was calm, not cruel, not triumphant. The voice of someone delivering a verdict that had already been finalized hours ago. "You chose at every single decision point to escalate. You chose intimidation over professionalism. You chose fabricated charges over accountability. You chose to make someone's wrists bleed rather than walk away from an ego bruise." She reached up and drew something from beneath the collar of her sweatshirt. A recording device. Small, matte, black, government grade. The indicator light had been blinking the entire time. She held it up so the cameras could see it clearly. "Every word," she said. "Every decision. Every instruction you gave to the booking sergeant. Documented." The deputy commissioner stepped forward, his voice barely held together. "Officer Mason, your weapon and your badge, now." What followed was not a moment. It was a reckoning. Mason's badge came off with a sound that everyone in that hallway would remember. Not a dramatic sound, just a small metallic click, the kind of sound that in any other context wouldn't register at all. In that context, it was deafening. His own handcuffs, the ones he'd used on Mara 4 hours earlier, were used to secure his wrists behind his back. He cried. He didn't sob dramatically, but they were tears, and they were real, and the cameras caught them, the way cameras always catch the thing you most want them to miss. He was walked out of the precinct the same way he'd walked Mara out of the courthouse, through a crowd, under observation, with nowhere to hide. The video, all of it, from the courthouse to the holding cell to the hallway, was everywhere before midnight. The image of Mara Sutton walking out of that cell, sweatshirt wrinkled, wrists marked, back straight, face entirely composed, became one of those images that lodges itself into public memory and refuses to leave. The investigation that followed was not a narrow one. Mara had not spent 2 days wandering this city and only found one problem. The recording device had done a great deal of work. Internal affairs moved quickly, because the new chief had given them no choice and no room to maneuver. Within 6 weeks, Sergeant Kowalski was suspended. 2 lieutenants, who had documented knowledge of Mason's behavior and had chosen not to report it, were stripped of their rank pending review. A financial investigation into the source of Mason's watch, and 3 other luxury items documented during the arrest processing, uncovered a protection arrangement with 2 local businesses that had been running for over 4 years. 14 officers were disciplined, 6 were terminated, 3 faced criminal charges. The precinct was not destroyed, it was rebuilt methodically from the foundation up. New supervisory protocols. Mandatory body camera compliance with real consequences for non-compliance. A civilian oversight board with actual subpoena power. An anonymous tip line for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, and a tracking system to ensure those tips were investigated, not buried. None of it was fast. Real reform is never fast. But it was real, and it was documented, and Mara Sutton made sure every step of it was transparent. 8 months later, Oliver Derek Mason sat at a defense table in Courtroom 7 of the Riverside County Courthouse. The irony was not lost on anyone in attendance. He was wearing civilian clothes, a collared shirt that was slightly too big for him now. The kind of detail that happens when a man spends months under the kind of stress that makes you forget to eat. He had lost the polished certainty that had once made him seem large in any room he entered. He looked ordinary. He looked honestly smaller than he ever had when he was in uniform. Mara Sutton took the witness stand. 4 gold stars on her collar. Uniform pressed to a standard that could probably survive a formal military inspection. She testified for 3 hours, and she was precise, methodical, and utterly devastating in the way that someone is when they are simply telling the truth, and the truth is enough. She didn't perform. She didn't editorializing. She answered what was asked, and what she answered was sufficient. The jury took 90 minutes. Guilty, on all counts. False imprisonment, excessive force under color of authority, falsification of official police records, abuse of official capacity. Judge Patricia Osei. Yes, the same defense attorney who had been conducting the suppression hearing when Mason first spotted Mara in that front row, who had subsequently been elevated to the bench, looked down at the defendant without theatrical pause. "You were given power," she said. "You were given a uniform, a badge, a weapon, and the authority of the state. These things were given to you in trust. You broke that trust, deliberately and repeatedly, and you chose to do it against someone who had done nothing, except exist in a space you decided she didn't belong in." The sentence was 7 years. Mason's head dropped to his chest. The gavel fell. Mara stood, adjusted her cover, and walked out of Courtroom 7 into the afternoon light. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, looking out at the city that was slowly, imperfectly, genuinely trying to become something better. She had known on day 2 of her incognito observation that this department was going to take everything she had. She had known that the work would be unglamorous and grinding, and that she would make enemies inside the very institution she was trying to repair. She had known that real reform doesn't happen in a viral moment. It happens in the 10,000 decisions that come after the viral moment, when the cameras are gone and the headlines have moved on, and it's just you and the work and the question of whether you mean what you said. She was still here. The work was still happening. And Officer Oliver Derek Mason, with his Rolex and his manufactured bravado and his absolute certainty that a woman in a college sweatshirt was nobody worth worrying about, was going to spend the next several years thinking carefully about the cost of underestimating people. Some lessons you can only learn one way, and some reckonings arrive quietly, in jeans and a faded sweatshirt, carrying a notebook and a recording device, and 16 years of experience dismantling exactly the kind of rot you thought no one would ever find. She found it. She always does.